So basically, I've come here to talk to you about being an entrepreneurial anthropologist. And this is sort of a mix of kind of thinking about using applied anthropology to sort of have your own consulting firm, and kind of like what that entails and some of the challenges that you have to sort of you have to sort of like confront when you're doing that. And so the presentation will be kind of a little bit about my professional journey, a little bit about what it means to be an anthropological consultant, some essential lessons that I learned from the field, then some resources, and then we'll try to do some Q&A. And I'll try to run through this since so my professional journey, I just want to start off with my Angelou that I wouldn't take nothing for my journey now. I've in some ways, I've been an accidental applied anthropologist. I kind of studied to sort of, be an academic, just theoretical anthropologist. And along the way, I kind of fell into this field. And it's taken me, as you can see, from factory shop floors to China with educators to the White House. As I said before, I trained in sociology and anthropology at the University of Florida and University of Texas at Austin, and I specialized in Afro-Caribbean religion. And I did dissertation research in the Dominican Republic in the Dominican Haitian borderlands, right? But in 1996, I moved to New York, and I didn't realize there wasn't anything that kind of figured out where people could tell you, like, here's how you apply, or here's how you turn doing Afro-Dominican religious practices into a rent-paying kind of occupation. So I had to try to figure out something else. And so I had worked on a project as an undergraduate called Living with Racism with the eminent racial theorist Joe Fagan, and they had done this sort of like kind of like in-depth research on what it was like to be middle-class African-American in the US. And as I came here, there was an immigration study that was started at CUNY, the Graduate Center, and they wanted to do something similar, so they hired me. So that started a sort of a more applied journey. So I went from policy think tanks I went back to academia for a couple of times. I've been in philanthropy. I've been at 2 different foundations. And then I've done consulting since 2019. Philanthropy has been the Fetzer Institute in Michigan and the National Education Association Foundation in Washington, D.C. I've been at UNC Chapel Hill, DePaul University. I was here at at CUNY, the Graduate Center, at the Howard Samuel Center for Management. And so that's kind of been my journey. And like I said, this is all accidental, and I learned along the way. And what I was hoping that this presentation would do is allow you all to kind of think about how to do it in a bit more rational way, and not sort of discover yourself falling through these traps that I did. Okay. And so just a little bit about the anthropological consultant. A consultant in the applied anthropological setting, and I work a lot with nonprofits. I work with major corporations, global corporations, and no client is the same. Every client, you have to kind of come up with a unique approach to that client and their problems. And so what that means is that you also have to figure out what are the various roles that a consultant can play. One is an ethnographer. The ethnographer part is figuring out exactly what their culture is, exactly what their real problems are, because a lot of times clients will come to you and they'll come to you with what they think are their problems. And through your own sort of diagnosis, you figure out they got a different problem, right? So then part of it is also being a change agent because you're being really brought in for organizational change, whether you're being brought in to sort of help people with teaming, or whether you're helping people deal with DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion issues, you're still trying to sort of create transformational change. And that means that you have to work in a way that sort of changes both individuals, groups, and systems simultaneously. And that's where a lot of this, also using the ethnographer's viewpoint, you can sort of figure out what those systems are, what their teams, how they actually work in practice. Because a lot of times I remember being at an oil facility in Houston, and I asked the question, has everybody felt like they could say what they wanted to say? And the boss jumped in and said, everybody has said exactly what they wanted to say. Nobody's been intimidated. And so again, he couldn't hear himself, but as I could hear him. So, and then I got this I separated. We hear a lot now in the business sector, this idea about servant leadership, right? And when you're a consultant, you have to practice servant leadership, but you also have to kind of be able to slide back and forth between sort of leading, but also sometimes being that you're being brought in as a hired gun. And sort of, it's a tricky kind of thing. If you can get over your skis a bit by leading too far. One client said that, the job is to lead from behind in some ways, but even with that, you have to figure out your client, because I know that there's some clients that come in and say, like I was on a phone call yesterday with a prospective client, and they were saying, tell us what you think we need to do. And it's clear that they want the leadership part more than they want the servant part. But there are companies where I've gone in that have very strong, cultural formulations of who they are and what they are. And they definitely want the more sort of like, you're our consultant, we pay you. You have to balance on how do you deliver that leadership, right? You have to do it in a way where it's kind of makes sense to them. So, apologies to Victor Turner, but consulting is negotiating a forest of symbols. It's about creating consultant value. And again, that's going to depend on client to client. So, there'll be times when you go into a company to use your applied skills, and your skills will not be understood for what they are. The contribution and the insights that you may bring to the table may be insufficient for them or they may not be ready for them, or you may have erred in your balance between servant and leadership. So sometimes it'll sort of go off. But what you have to sort of think about is, as you try to think about what the consulting value is, you have to think about the context, the organization, and the individuals that you're working with. You're at the center of that. You're at the center of serving as a sounding board. Again, what we're talking about, advocacy, thinking about how to build capacity, but you also have to help organizations make sense of their reality. Because a lot of times what I find in my practice is that everybody collects a lot of data, but the data they have is just a bunch of data. It doesn't tell a story. It doesn't help them gain any insights. It doesn't help them to sort of figure out what the next steps are. And so sometimes what you're doing is you're coming in and you're taking the data they give you and you're helping them to sort of just think, here's what this says to me. So for right now, I'm working with a big pharmaceutical company, and they've asked me to do an audit of their performance management system. Performance management of sort of like, not just sort of telling you how you did last year with your performance, but how to set you up for future development and growth. I know nothing about performance management, right? But again, I had to use my ethnographic skills to go and do a lot of research, figure that all out, and then figure out my research skills. What would a research, proposal look like? And part of what I had to do was I had to say, in an ideal world, here's what I would do. Now, I have to work with a client to say, is this politically feasible? Because I've asked to pull 350 personnel records, and that may not work. I'm still waiting on an answer, right? But that's what I mean about in terms of, but I do think that what I propose to them will allow them to see if the discrepancies that they are finding, the differentials, may have any real significance. So if they do tell a story, because sometimes differentials in numbers and data don't necessarily mean anything, and sometimes they mean everything. So anyway, so that's that, negotiating that forest of symbols, of really negotiating all of these different factors. And sometimes it works really well and you make really great music. And sometimes it just goes pear-shaped. So, but here's, throughout this whole thing, here's some of the lessons that I've learned from this field, from getting into this in an accidental way. And this, I'll just kind of give you an overview real quick, which is sort of mind the gap, which means to keep on learning. Changing landscapes and audiences, so read the room. Foreign tongues, to make sure that you're always code switching. And then I'll go through these in a little bit more. So mind the gap. Never stop learning. We, as anthropologists, we have been given one of the best toolkits out there available to do anything that we could possibly dream of. But despite having a really great toolkit, it doesn't mean that our toolkit is complete. We always have to be figuring out new ways to add additional tools to that toolkit and to figure out new things to think about. So for example, recently I went and did a certificate on DEI, for example. A lot of it was stuff that I had picked up through my own research, but it works well with clients if they see that you have some sort of credential in the area. But also I did learn new things as well. And especially because that you're working in new fields with new language and new perspectives, sometimes you want to make sure that you're always like figuring out what those gaps are between how you would look at it and how, so I can't come to clients mostly and say, that's a social construct, for example, and expect them to sort of like, that resonates, right? I have to kind of figure out another way to sort of translate that into their own kind of idea. But so part of it is trying to figure out the major concepts, themes, and theories that shape their own business. So I do a lot of reading on business topics, because what I found with clients is it's kind of like anthropology, because a certain theory or author will become really famous and everybody's talking about that theorist or that person, right? So like I do DEI work a lot. And so right now everybody's talking about white fragility, right? In that book. I think that it has some good insights. I also have some trouble with it in terms of what does it really mean for a corporation or organization moving forward if it's just centered on white fragility. But by knowing what the conversation is, I can create those interventions that allow me to add different perspectives and to translate what is a good conversation opener into something that can be actionable for that group, right? So always be learning, taking courses and the rest of it. I think I've probably done 4 postdoctoral fellowships by now in leadership, higher education leadership. I did a Fulbright. So I just continue to do that kind of work because it just helps, changing landscapes and audiences. Like any social group, each client offers a unique culture that requires a tailored engagement strategy. So it's best to read the room. This is where field work never ends. Every time you enter into a client's, setting, you have to be trying to figure out what do all these things mean? Who are these people? Because people will oftentimes come to you and say, I had a client once who said that I want to change this organization. Will you help me write a strategic plan? So I helped write a strategic plan. And she came back to me and she said, this doesn't look like the last strategic plan. And I was like, I thought she wanted something different. But I didn't read the room well at that moment, right? but you also have to do that to determine the culture and the taboos. Sometimes you can step on a third rail quite easily. I have a client who they have let's just say they have a real strong religious orientation. And they pray in meetings. That's how they start meetings. That's how they end meetings. But they're a major corporation, and they've had some trouble with some of these diversity issues. I mean, it's not hard to figure out why, but sometimes when you try to bring them a discussion of why they running into trouble, everybody kind of shuts down. They know they need to talk about it, but when you actually bring that conversation to them, it shuts everybody down. Even when you find positive things, like, so for example, with this client, I found a case study that a business school did about how basically it talked about how they confronted this problem. They created some solutions, they created a new marketing plan, and they recognized that they didn't know all the answers. It was a great case study, but the case study was a little bit too much for them for some reason. They didn't have that sort of they just said, well, this case study was from 2015. They said it's 2022. This doesn't teach us anything now. Now, mind you, they had never seen the case study, which was also strange to me, but okay, it happens. Let's see here. So code switching is essential. We talked a little bit about it before, that, social sciences and business share a lot in common, but they often use different vocabulary to speak of their organizational realities, right? They're different. And so you got to be able to sort of take the anthropological jargon that we use and turn it into business and organizational discourse. But also just to realize that for the most part, I think at the heart of it is too, that people use a lot of jargon that doesn't necessarily mean much, but everybody sort of thinks it means a lot. So like in philanthropy, somebody put out a 40-page book about, all the jargon in philanthropy, and it defines what that jargon means and why it's nonsensical. But we tend to do that. We tend to sort of speak in shorthand. Everything kind of becomes, the insider group, and we all sort of imagine and nod our head like we all know what we're talking about. And we oftentimes don't question others when they're bringing up this jargon, or they're bringing it up in a context that may raise certain kinds of issues. But be careful and be able to code switch, because I do think that the anthropological theories and perspectives and understandings that we have a lot to bring to change and change management. But once they're translated into the proper language of the moment, they just sort of resonate a lot better. So sometimes it is being in a situation where you are like, it's like foreign tongues, right? So again, those are the kind of things that I think the big lessons are: mind the gap. So that means keep on learning. With the changing landscapes and audiences, you got to read the room. With the foreign tongues, the differences in discourse, you have to continuously code switch. And that's where the learning allows you, by reading the latest business books, that allows you to kind of figure out, because I remember the first time I heard like the word curated, right? Not in a business context. And then I realized that everybody was using this word curated, as if somehow they just discovered this idea of, we use the word curated, it means that we're more intentional than we have been last week. So just to sort of pick up on little things like that, because it does make a difference of being an outsider, because as a consultant, you are an outsider. Just like as an anthropologist going into field work, you're an outsider, and you have to figure out how to sort of survive in this place. Not just survive, but survive in a way where people trust you, they share intimate details, and you're able to sort of shift things around. And it's only through trust that you can move people. This is all about networks. This is all about social relationships. This is all about, whether it's talking about mouse is the gift, Drums of Affliction. It's all about figuring out how to heal communities. So I had a group of independent movie theaters that do an annual conference in Sundance. And they had a situation where they had brought somebody in to curate, and in this way, it's the proper word, curate, the sort of slate of movies and conversations that would be shown prior to Sundance. And then 2 weeks before the thing happened, she was let go without any explanation. And then other people throughout the network were saying she was difficult to work with. She didn't add anything. And when they did the conference, her name was nowhere to be found, despite, so 11 months of work, 2 weeks before the conference, they let her go, which was a volunteer position, by the way. And there's no credit for any of the work that she had done. So they thought they just needed how to talk about race relations, how to talk across gender. But part of what I came in and suggested that they do is think about a restorative justice model and how to sort of like heal their community and heal their bonds, and to learn to take what happened as opportunity to reflect on who they are as a community and what they want to do, and that they were a peer learning community. And so to think about it like that, they really like that idea. By the time 2 weeks ago, the person that had been harmed the most came back to the conversation and integrated back into the community. But I was clear with them that she was harmed the most. But in the end, when organizations don't live up to their values, everybody's harmed, right? So, so this is just some quick resources I think that any anthropological consultant should have. So these are how to do consulting in general. So Flawless Consulting by Peter Block, A Guide to Getting Your Expertise Used. It's a great book. It's a great sort of like anchoring book to think about the practice. Because it's so hard once you move from sort of the sort of generous sort of ways in which we're taught to be in anthropology to consulting, where you have to be a little bit more clear about time and your resources. Because if not, if you charge for 10 hours, but you end up giving 30 hours, what you're really making changes. One of the other ideas is, designing and leading life-changing workshops. A lot of this work happens in, workshops. The Facilitator's Field Book, something to sort of think about how to facilitate groups and group processes, because that'll be a lot of what you need to do. These are the kind of like resources to keep up with all the time. Harvard Business Review is a really good one. Stanford Social Innovation Review. Stanford is a good one. And then just the HBR guides. So for example, when I had to do the performance management piece, I had to go to the HBR guide on performance management. It's not the only thing I did, but it's one of the major grounding pieces that I did. And then a lot of this work in the end is about reflection. It's about creating a space where people can hear themselves and think for themselves, because in the end, as a consultant, I don't believe I have the answers. What I do believe I have is the tools to allow people to think critically and to hear themselves finally. And so some of the works that have been good for me, Parker Palmer, Let Your Life Speak, and Hidden Wholeness. I actually, at the Fetzer Institute, got a chance to train extensively with him. And these are really great tools for circle work and organizational change. A lot of times it's a little bit hippie for businesses, but there's times when, again, you got to do that leading and advocacy and push some of the tools that they're not used to, but that can, bring really good outcomes. And this is Love is a Killer app. I just love this book because it's all about sort of like because it's somebody that was at Yahoo but also has this sort of reflective piece and networking and social relations. And they just have a lot of really great ideas about how to be a love cat, they talk about. And I think that it benefits a lot of people that a lot of times in business, in organizations and in business, people believe they have to be competitive and cutthroat, and they can't be collaborative. And that is a road to ruin. Okay, so and then we have the leading in a culture of change, Michael Fallon, The Bureaucratic Entrepreneur by Richard Haas, How to Be Effective in an Unruly Organization. This is a masterpiece. Then we have Rebels at Work, a handbook for leading change from within. And one of the co-authors of this was a former high-ranking official at the CIA. And so she has really great tables and ways to think about it. Both of these authors, Kelly and Medina, have great ways to sort of like summarize how to lead change when change isn't working. It is just a really great tactical textbook, and it's really fun. And they also have a great website where they have great blogs and things like that. Yes. So, and then, so any questions? Sorry for the snafu with the timing business, but any questions in the time that we have left?
Yeah, my question is, when you transition into being a consultant, how did you build your client list?
So luckily what happened was when I got ready to transition, I had some friends that I went to graduate school with that were doing the work and that had been kind of, talking to me for quite a while to come do the work. And so they had a client list already built up. And then from there, I've built more clients and I've built additional collaborations. So, like I have my own individual company, but I also work for other companies. Like I'll work for like the Litz, for example, and I'll work for medium-sized firms. But then word of mouth, somebody will bring like a friend will say, hey, I think Robert might be able to help you on this. So they'll bring me a client. So it's a mix, but really you want to keep it as diversified as possible because, because it kind of like ebbs and, flows and, expands. And sometimes you have way too much work and sometimes you just don't have enough work. Yeah. Anything else?
This was, thanks for really interesting. And part of what you mentioned, Duncan, part of our conversation before. Can you tell us a little bit about the code switching piece and like how did you start figuring out as a trained anthropologist how to speak business? How did you get into that?
So I think I've only identified that there is that need to code switch.
Okay.
I don't think I've really mastered it all completely yet. And it just had to do with kind of like, the KPIs when people were speaking things about like that, or even in terms of how they thought about strategies and goals and what values were. Sometimes that sort of, I could feel that there was a gap there, but I've participated in a fellowship called First Movers out of the Aspen Institute that I went through this program with a bunch of folks in business. And, so one of the people, Mary Gentili, Giving Voice to Value, she wrote the book. And so she helped us to sort of go through and think about this disjuncture of how business looks at these things about values and how one should could rethink that to get profitable outcomes, but still be ethical and value centered. So those are ways.
Can I just make a comment on that? If you're associated with the university, audit an introduction to business class. Audit basic business class because you're already at the school and give you all the vocab that you need to at least be able to start the conversation.
And also recognize sometimes the businesses don't actually know what they're saying.
Yeah. Right.
They're just like, oh yes, alignment. Yes, we need that.
Right.
That's the incredibly interesting thing is that, we hear business lingo seeping into the university as well. Right?
Yeah.
It's there, but I think it's more extensive than.
So for example, and this is just to kind of show you AAUP just put out a report about the North Carolina university system 2 weeks ago, and they talk about a list of sort of systemic failures in the system as it has become very politicized and the ways that it's translated into them not following their own governance model, searches that are not being done in a proper fashion. And they focus on UNC Chapel Hill, but they look at the whole system in general. And like, so what you can see is that and I think it's the same as any field, but people tend to talk in the same sort of like ideas as if they're actually putting those things into motion. So to set up governance means that you're following governance, and that's where by our discovery work and our field work, we can kind of show that gap, right? And this is exactly what this report does. It goes through and just really reads the university to kind of say, you say that this is the model, this is the general model between faculty, the university and its board of directors. You guys aren't following that model that has been followed for 100 years now. So that was a really great report. So that's what I try to do is I try to read these various reports that come out. I also try to read a lot of indictments and legal cases, because that'll tell you a lot of show you. So then you can kind of bring that up. You can figure out, for compliance, EEOC compliance issues, a lot of times people just don't know when they've kind of gone awry. It ought to be obvious, but they can't see it. And so their systems fail. So to set up a system doesn't mean that it's actually working or that they're actually putting it in practice. That's part of what the consultant is there to help them to show that gap between say and do. That's a big part of the work. Yeah. So, well, I'll go here and then there. Yeah.
Thank you for the talk. The resources look great, and I look forward to digging into them. I had a question kind of about qualitative methods, and I think this kind of came up earlier. I've worked in a couple sectors, and I feel there's a strong preference for quantitative work. So with that deep qualitative work, how do you either kind of position the work, or what work areas have you found that really support that deep qualitative work?
Well, so I'm a real big fan of focus groups. I really think that, and so some of it is just you have to educate your clients about that, because they are a lot more quantitative. But part of it is through the data analysis, you can really show them also how they're not reading their data, or they haven't sort of done enough, they're not really doing anything quantitative as much as they say they believe in quantitative, right? But then you can also educate them about the qualitative piece, because when you work on the qualitative piece, you can really bring some deep insights. I worked at a paper plant not too long ago, and the employees asked for a safety board. That wouldn't have come out in any kind of pulse survey or any kind of thing like that. But they said it was a big motivator for them, right? And the leadership was surprised that they wanted something to keep themselves accountable. That didn't make sense to them, because they had their own assumptions and things like that.
So you feel like field work and public.
Mhm.
I'm curious about an example of the skill that you learned during that field work changes in
Not to never give up, to not let a relationship that maybe starts with distrust, to let it stay there. So I'll tell you, so when I was doing my field work, I worked with this one healer, and her husband got jealous, and so he poisoned me, and I got pretty sick, right? And then from there, the next year when I came back, instead of saying, okay, well, this is my mortal enemy, I brought him back a bottle of Jim Beam in Maker's Mark. And we're fast friends. That turned everything around.
I'm not sure I know how to word this, but I've actually worked in dysfunctional academic departments.
Are there other kinds?
One that was so dysfunctional that the administration sent us on a retreat with psychologists to have people interact, because there were people suing each other in the department. And yeah, it was a really awful situation, but my question isn't about how awful it is. My question is that if you came to a group like that with a restorative justice approach, because faculty are socialized to exceed as individuals, it's very difficult for people to reach out their hand to each other if there's bad blood or there's some kind of dysfunction, or there's perhaps arguments over space or students or money or how many squares in the tiles in the surface, in the ceiling of your office, how big your office is. And I've actually witnessed this firsthand a couple of times now. And I'm wondering, so how do you do it when people don't have the motivation to do the connections that you've been talking about in the organization that's dysfunctional?
I think, so I start off with this idea that human beings are broken, traumatized, units, right? And so that's from the beginning. So that's where I start. But then also, I think that if we find our 6 degrees of separation, if we lift up and illuminate how we have more in common and more collaboration together, because even in a dysfunctional department, sometimes just by walking people down memory lane can be a lot toward getting them into a space of like, let's just hear each other. Remember when we did that cookout, or remember when we did that project together? Because what happens is once that sort of animosity starts, people don't want to like let it go. They continue to sort of fuel it, and they continue to sort of curate their sense of sort of injustice. The other thing I think that's the other piece is that in general, I think our culture in a lot of ways teaches us to think about ourselves as victims, about how other people are getting the best of us. So that's one of the starting places. And so that we oftentimes have to sort of turn that around a little bit and create a reflection space of, because that's one of the dangers with the idea about the privilege, unpacking the backpack of privilege, is that you have to understand that somebody could be privileged, but still not understand or experience their life in a way where they just think everything just comes to me. They still understand their lives in the terms of struggle, what they didn't get, ways in which their dreams are still sort of unfulfilled. So you can't sort of just say, you grew up wealthy, you must have not had a care in the world. So you have to sort of start with trying to figure out what individual people's trauma is. And again, sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes sometimes these things are not fixable because people are committed to being disagreeable with one another. When it does work, it's great.
Well, collegiality has no role in tenure.
Right, exactly. So yeah.
Just to follow up on that, there's 2 really good books. One is called Marketing with the Devil by the CIA negotiator, Robert Lucan, I think is what it is. And then another book, that's really good on theoretical stuff, high level, how to deal with people who are purposely, engaged in animosity. And then the second one is called Crucial Conversations, Critical Conversations, books on that same authors. And those are how-to books. So specifically, this is how to facilitate better communications in areas of conflict.
Yeah. And in the book, Hidden Wholeness by Parker Palmer is a really good book so he spent a lot of time using sort of Quaker ideology and practices like the clearance committee, things like that he brings to the table that are really good. Yeah. So I had somebody back there. Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation and all the wonderful references and resources. I'm just wondering, is there a right time to become an entrepreneur, an anthropological entrepreneur, or are we sort of by default entrepreneurs sort of
So yeah, thank you for that, because in my haste, I kind of didn't explain why I said entrepreneurial. So the landscape's always changing. The journey is always evolving. There's not a sort of a plug and play type thing, that you always have to be reading the marketplace and then your toolkit and your brand and the rest of it together to make sure that you're maximizing your value, but also maximizing who you are as a person. I would say there are a number of clients that I'm probably not the perfect client for. The perfect consultant for, because of my style. I'm a lot more squishy, and I still am a lot more. You can tell that the religious piece, of studying religion, the part about sort of the heart and love. So when I worked at Fetzer, which is a foundation with about $500 million, our mission was love, forgiveness, and compassion. And then I further got to work with people like, Archbishop Tutu. And so that really has shaped who I am. And so I wear that. I don't try to hide from it. And if a client thinks that's not what they need, that's not what they need. You know, so I don't try to force it down. So that's also part of the entrepreneurial piece, is to sort of like, you know, keep doing my own reflection to make sure that I'm being authentic and true to who I am. You know, and so even in terms of doing something like this, you know, I really believe in people sharing knowledge, and, you know, that we're better. 1 + 1 = 3. So we create new types of knowledge, new types of insights, and new types of things that people didn't see before. And that's the other piece about being entrepreneurial. And that's why I don't do well in dysfunctional academic departments. Yeah, you know, there's a guy that once wrote a book, a novel based on his problems in his department. I think it's called Hitler's Heart or something. You know, but you know, he was one of the dysfunctional characters in that department. Yeah. So again, apologies for the time mix-up, but I hope this was you know, provided some sort of insights and things like that. And so my email is there. You know, feel free to reach out. I think the resources will be shared, but if they're not, I can share them, you know, because those are, you know, they're pretty classic. And so, yeah, so thank you all, and apologies again. Oh, Rada, RADA 141265 @gmail. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Thanks, Doug.